art as therapy for trauma. That's our topic for today. And so for the next 50 minutes or so, we'll be exploring this very expansive topic, and I hope to be able to distill it all into a thimble or a nutshell for us. Now, given the nature of this topic, there will be a lot of visuals in my slides. And if at any point in time, if any of you are feeling uncomfortable with the visuals or with the topic, or you're feeling particularly triggered, please feel free to either, turn off your screen, or if you need to, just step away, get yourself a drink, and then come back again when you're feeling more safe, more comfortable to resume this talk. All right? Now, art as therapy for trauma. So, as we go along, since I'm not able to see the your chats while I'm looking at my slides, so I suppose feel free to type in your questions as we go along, and I will try to address any queries or questions you may have at the end of my talk, my presentation. Okay, so what we are seeing here in this slide is actually the front and back covers of a notebook or notepad, which a local social service agency that works with survivors of family violence had published, and they were actually giving out these notebooks as part of their public outreach or public education campaign. Now, the front and back covers of the notebook actually consists of art pieces or paintings done by survivors of family violence, the social service agency's clients. So as you see here, you can see that there are actually different themes which emerge from the artworks, perhaps themes of salvation, safety, redemption, themes of, what else do we have here? Themes of new beginnings, themes of rescue, right? So this is just a very quick, simple introduction to how art was able to help the survivors of family violence to facilitate their recovery and their healing from the trauma of family violence. Now, in the next 15 minutes or so, this is what I hope to cover. We'll be looking at trauma, what it is, and its impact on us. We will then look at the difference between art and arts. And specifically, we will look at how art as therapy for trauma works. Okay, so in this regard, we will then look into art therapy and some examples of art therapy, as opposed to art as therapy, and some examples of that, because these two are quite different, art therapy and art as therapy. We will then end by looking at some curative factors that help in trauma recovery. Okay, trauma. So what is trauma? Trauma can be called an emotional response to a terrible event that happened, and it has both short-term effects and longer-term effects in the form of flashbacks, strained relationships, and even physiological or physical symptoms which is experienced. Additionally, trauma can also be called a psychic wound that impacts us such that it interferes with our ability to grow personally and to develop as individuals, as human beings. So trauma is not just what happened to us, but what happens and continues to happen to us inside. Okay, So the picture that you see in this slide is famously known as the Scream. The painter is Edward Munch, and I picked this painting to depict trauma because the colors and the picture of this person here holding the face in this silent scream, I thought it was a very apt communication of what trauma feels like, what trauma looks like. Trauma can also be defined as an inescapable stressful event that overwhelms a person's inner resources and outer resources for coping. I particularly like this definition, and I will be coming back to this definition as we go along. So essentially what trauma does to us is when it overwhelms our coping mechanisms, whether it's our internal or external resources for coping, that's what trauma is. So trauma, there is trauma with a capital T, meaning these are the kind of really catastrophic events like tsunamis, plane crashes, earthquakes, war, right? There's also trauma in the form of micro traumas. It could be systemic experiences of systemic harassment, discrimination, which exists in one's environment. There is secondary trauma and vicarious trauma. These are types of trauma usually experienced by first responders, people in the helping profession, where through the interaction with the victims of trauma, you yourself may be impacted as well, right? There's also relational trauma, which refers more to trauma that happens in early childhood and during adolescence, where the trauma is actually perpetrated by the caregiver. So what happens is that there is a break in that relationship, the caregiving relationship, that and hence is called relational trauma. Traumatic grief results when there is a sudden and unexpected death of a loved one. And because it is so sudden and unexpected, it may overwhelm our ability to cope with that grief. Intergenerational trauma is trauma that is actually transmitted or carried down from one generation to another. There's actually studies to show that trauma can actually impact epigenetics and our gene expressions, such that the DNA itself is altered. So it makes perfect sense then that intergenerational trauma can take place from one generation to another. Collective trauma applies to groups of individuals or societies or communities who may experience the same traumatic events collectively as a whole, right? So the picture that you see here in this slide is that of a war situation. So being caught in a war and warfare itself can be pretty traumatic, but not every war survivor would be traumatized. It all depends on the person's coping mechanisms. So this picture here that you see in this slide is of the Twin Towers from September 11. Okay, so there has been studies that explored how individuals who were nowhere near the Twin Towers, were nowhere near New York for that matter, but may have been in other parts of the world, when they viewed these images which were played by the media over and over, and it's very graphic, it's very visual, of, these, you can actually see even people jumping out from the buildings as they collapse. The visual and graphic effect of this actually resulted in the viewers themselves developing secondary trauma. Here we see other pictures that basically shows us the other types of trauma that can happen. Being a victim of racism, especially if it's systemic in one's environment. Long-term caregiving, the stresses of long-term caregiving can also result in trauma. Domestic violence, of course, and childhood abuse, sexual, physical, emotional abuse, abandonment and neglect can result in relational trauma. And traumatic grief, when a loved one passes away suddenly and unexpectedly. And this picture here that I've shown of looks like a healthcare staff in protective gear and scrubs. This, I think, can refer to collective trauma. What we're seeing now with this pandemic, this ongoing pandemic, we are hearing a lot of stories of frontline healthcare personnel experiencing not just burnout, compassion fatigue, but a lot of collective trauma in terms of the unmanageable and uncontrollable cases coming in and the deaths that they are experiencing, and also the sense of helplessness of not being able to help these COVID patients. Okay. So that's very briefly the definition of trauma. Next, we're going to look at trauma's impact on us. This is a very big word, quite a mouthful, psycho-endo-neuroimmunology. And basically, if we break it up, it just tells us that trauma impacts our psychology. It impacts our endocrinology, meaning our hormones, the hormonal and chemical production of the body. It impacts our neurology, that means our nervous system and the brain system. In addition, trauma also impacts our immunology. That means the body and the organs' ability to mount defenses against inflammation and sicknesses and illnesses. So how is it that the trauma can impact the mind and the body so extensively? To understand this, we can use this very simple model of the brain that is called the triune brain. So essentially, to put it rather simplistically, the brain consists of three parts. And the way the brain develops from in utero itself, it starts with the brain stem, otherwise known as the reptilian brain. And this is the part of the brain or our nervous system that governs the very basic functions that keep us alive, like our breathing and our heart rate and reproduction as well. This nervous system, the reptilian brain, you can find that there is the vagus nerve that runs along this the spine that connects to the organs in the body, right? So from this reptilian brain, if you have your thumb here and you fold in your thumb, this folded in thumb can represent the mammalian brain, and this is the part of our brains that control our emotions, that help process memories, habits, emotional attachments. This is also the part of the brain that governs the fight, flight, or freeze responses when we sense there is a major threat in our environment. All right, so that's the mammalian brain, the the reptilian brain, mammalian brain, and the last part of the brain that develops in utero and continues to develop even after birth is the human brain. So if we take our four fingers and we fold it over the thumb, this is the frontal cortex, the part of the brain that is responsible for verbal processing, learning, behavior regulation, the part of the brain that governs abstract thinking, awareness, and consciousness, right? So the triune brain of the reptilian brain, the mammalian brain, and the human brain, they are all interconnected. But the part that trauma impacts the most and lodges itself in very firmly is here. I see someone raised a hand. Can I get back to you when I'm done? I'm so sorry. So it's here at the mammalian brain. But because everything is interconnected, you will see that if trauma happens in early childhood, it can affect the brain development, resulting in behavioral and learning issues, ability to self-regulate. It can manifest itself in physiological symptoms because of the fight, flight, and freeze responses. So such examples would be palpitations, shortness of breath, gastrointestinal issues, muscle tensions. These are all functions of the body getting ready for the fight or flight or freeze responses. Psychological difficulties such as PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, depression, anxiety, emotional reactivity. These are psychological difficulties which result from trauma. And trauma has very wide ranging implications and repercussions. It affects our relationships, affects our ability to hold down jobs as well, right? So it's pretty extensive, the impact of trauma. Another way to look at how trauma impacts us is by looking at the window of tolerance model. So remember I talked about the fight, flight, or freeze response, which trauma triggers. So if we are operating from the fight or flight realm, we are constantly operating from a place of hyperarousal, meaning that we are always scanning for threats to our survival from our environment. So this is a state where we find ourselves constantly anxious or angry. So either the state of hyperarousal or hypoarousal, where we are operating from the freeze response. So our body shuts down. Our ability to feel is also very low and dampened. Now, when you're operating from either the hyperarousal or hypoarousal, your window of tolerance becomes restricted. So what is this window of tolerance we're talking about? The window of tolerance is a space where a place and a space of balance and homeostasis, where you're able to handle most normal stresses and pressures and then come back to a state of balance, equilibrium, as it were. What happens when trauma takes over is that it squeezes our window of tolerance so that it becomes very narrow, right? And we are constantly reactive, either panicking or being anxious or not able to rise up to handle and meet the normal pressures of life. Maybe I'll finish the slide first, and then maybe if I'm able to look at some of the questions if you have any. Psychologically as well, what trauma does to us, it shatters our sense of self and identity. and time as well. So the past becomes alive in the present because the traumatic memories keep on being relived in the present, as if we are reliving the trauma over and over and over again, long after the threats to our survival have been removed. They're no longer there, right? So the memories itself become displaced instead of living or being properly contextualized as part of the past events. It becomes alive every day, every moment in the present. Okay, so I think having looked at the definition of trauma and trauma's impact, it was a bit heavy going. Let me just check and see. I think there are some questions. Okay, somebody wants a copy of the slides. I think the recording would be made available, but yeah, but maybe not the hard copy of the slides. Integrate the parts to release trauma. Yes, I'll be coming to that in my slides soon. What can we do to expand our window of tolerance? Yes, we're going to look at that as well. Okay, very, very good questions. Thank you. So that's what we hope to discuss and look at in the next few slides. Okay. All right. So just please bear with me. I hope to be able to answer your questions in the next few slides. Okay. So let me just continue with the slides. So having looked at the definition of trauma and trauma's impact on us, we're just going to switch or shift gears a little bit to look at art and the arts. Because after all, today's topic is art as therapy for trauma, right? So art conventionally has been understood to refer to the visual arts, meaning painting, drawing, sculpture, photography. Now, art itself exists within a broader realm of the arts, which covers music, drama, writing, movement, dance, and all these exist within an even wider, bigger realm of creative expressions, right? Our ability to be creative, our ability to explore and make sense of our inner and outer environment through exploration that helps us to gain insight and make meaning of experiences. That is basically creativity, right? So the art and the arts is just one aspect of this this creative realm in which we exist. Now, creativity is not necessarily limited just to art and the arts. Creativity can also be demonstrated in our ways of being and living, how we live our lives, whether it is in your home DIY projects, whether it's with your recipes, your cooking, whether it is in your solutioning, in your job as teaching, right? How you make your lessons come alive, whether it's, let's say, your policy maker, being able to come up with solutions and think out of the box, whether you're an engineer. All these are just ways for us to be creative, and all of us are born creative. We can tap into our own inner creativity. I often hear people tell me that, oh, I'm not good at drawing, I'm not a creative person. And I think it's very unfortunate that a lot of us may have had unpleasant experiences in school from art lessons or with art teachers, such that we think we are not able to be creative, and which is not true, right? Okay, so oops. Okay, so now I'm going to look at how art as therapy for trauma works. Okay. Now, on the left side is basically a reiteration of the model of the triune brain that we talked about earlier, right? Remember the reptilian brain, mammalian brain, and the human brain. Now, on the right side of my slide, this is what we call the expressive therapies continuum, which basically shows us the levels of engagement which are activated in the process of art making, whether we are dancing, whether we are drawing, taking pictures, or just tapping into our creativity for to express ourselves, right? So at the bottom, lowest level, there is the kinesthetic component, which is activated. And this kinesthetic component refers to movement. It could be a fine movement of just your fingers or your hands. It could be bigger movements of the hands, the legs, your body, the way you're moving about. This is activated in the art making at a sensorial level as well. So our senses are also activated in art making, right? So not just what we see, it could be what we hear, what we feel, it could be what we smell, sometimes even what we taste, if you are able to taste your materials, right? At another level, there is the perceptual component, the ability to perceive and to sense, say, dimensions, scales, how things relate to each other. All right, there is the affective component, which refers to our emotions, and we engage with our emotions in art making. We will be able to identify, am I feeling sad now, happy, excited, angry, or I'm feeling very low. So that's another level which is engaged and activated when we are engaged in the process of art making. At another level as well, there's the cognitive component, which is the ability to rationalize, to reason, to think, to make sense, to make meaning of what we do. At another level as well, there is metaphorical or symbolic component in the art making, meaning that when we make certain marks, we draw certain things, that what we have created holds certain meaning. It holds certain interpretations for us. And all these exist within the realm of the creative, right? So if you take this expressive therapies continuum and you superimpose it on the triune brain, you can see that there's almost a parallel mapping of the different functions of the brain and how art making and the different levels of engagement maps very closely the different functions of the brain, from the basic, the kinesthetic, the movements. Art making can help us actually regulate our heart rate and our breathing by bringing about a state of calmness, right? It helps us access and regulate our emotions as well, right? From being hyper-aroused or hypo-aroused, it brings us back into a state of equilibrium and balance. It also engages the human brain, the functioning to help us make meaning, make sense of all that has happened through the use of symbols or metaphors. Okay, so this, I hope, answers one of the earlier questions about how do we integrate all this to address trauma. Okay, we will be looking at more slides in the next few minutes as examples of how this can be done. So art as therapy for trauma, how it works is that it helps, through the art making, it helps us to reintegrate the shattered parts of ourselves, the shattered parts of our identity, it helps bring it all together again. It provides a platform for mourning and grieving for the losses that may have taken place due to the trauma. And it also helps contextualize the memories. So it provides a proper placement for the memories to put them back into the context of what happened. It helps us to rewrite the narrative of our lives as well. And ultimately, it's about slowly and very gradually providing for a way for us to desensitize ourselves to the difficult physiological symptoms, to slowly, little by little, expose ourselves so that we are better able to tolerate the physical and physiological experiences. Okay. Okay. Let's go. I think there are some questions here, so maybe I can just have a look at the questions before we look at art therapy versus art as therapy. Okay, so give me a minute. Okay, I think somebody had raised a question just now. No? Okay, never mind. Sorry for that. So what is the difference between art therapy and art as therapy? Basically, art therapy, it's a form of therapy which uses art and art making, right? So it necessarily implies that you would need to have the presence of an art therapist, a person who is properly qualified and credentialed to conduct the art therapy with the individual. That is art therapy, okay? Versus art as therapy. Art as therapy basically refers to your art making activities which you can engage in on your own. So you do not necessarily need to have an art therapist with you. You can do it on your own, or you can do it with groups of friends or like-minded people who share this same interest in this particular activity. Okay, so art therapy is very specific. It is a kind of therapy conducted by art therapists versus art as therapy. Okay, so let's just look at art therapy first. Okay, now it has been said that art is a way of communicating that which words cannot describe. So especially in the field of trauma, there might be a lot of very difficult experiences, and it's hard to verbalize those experiences, right? It could be a lot of experiencing, the emotional experiencing or the physiological experiencing. And sometimes when we try to verbalize it, we are perhaps sometimes hindered by the vocabulary. We might be hindered by our fluency in the language, or just sometimes the extent of that pain. There are just no words for it. So this is where art therapy can be a very powerful therapy in trauma recovery. So art therapy combines human development theories, psychology, understanding about psychology, and counseling skills with visual arts and creative techniques into a unique approach to help clients improve their psychological health. So it doesn't rely predominantly on talking or verbalizing, but it uses all these other tools as well. So very quickly, Adrian Hill is known as the father of art therapy. This is a picture that he painted, which depicts the landscape of World War I. He survived, he served as a soldier in World War I. And so this is what the landscape looked like to him. He painted this. In 1942, Adrian Hill was hospitalized for tuberculosis. And as he was recovering, he engaged in art making, and he found that the art making helped to provide psychological relief. It helped with emotional healing and also aided his physical recovery from the tuberculosis. And from there, the mind-body connection, which art therapy addresses, has become a core pillar in art therapy. I'll skip this slide. So in art therapy, you would have the client, you have the art therapist, then another very prominent party in this whole relationship is the artwork and the art making. So unlike talk therapy, where there is just the client and the therapist, in art therapy, you actually have the artwork and the art making as a way to facilitate healing and recovery. So if you are engaging an art therapist to help you, these are some of the, just some, it's not an exhaustive list, just some principles from which an art therapist would operate. First and foremost, the importance of establishing psychological and emotional safety, especially in the context of trauma where our sense of safety is shattered. So when you engage in art making, the psychological and emotional safety is very important, and learning how to build up and strengthen that sense of safety. So that the window of tolerance, we looked at it earlier, and someone had also mentioned, how do we widen it? Yes, we can widen this window of tolerance, but through a principle of titration or slowly, very slowly, bit by bit by bit. You do not force open that window of tolerance, because when you do anything by force, you are actually threatening the psychological and emotional safety of the individual. So we have to be very slow and careful, and it's always client-led. We proceed according to a pace that is comfortable for the client, right? Now, the use of materials in the art making needs to be very intentional and carefully selected, because some materials can be very triggering. And if it's triggering, it again threatens that sense of safety. For example, it has been documented that survivors of sexual abuse may find certain materials which are wet or viscous as particularly triggering, because it might be a reminder of certain body parts or bodily fluids. So if an art therapist is aware that the client has such a history, then you might want to steer away from using materials like clay, for instance, or anything that's too wet or viscous, right? And in art therapy, the focus often is not on the outcome or the output itself, but it's on the process, right? So we're just going to look at other examples. In art therapy, the use of metaphors and symbols is something that is a given. Remember, we looked at the different levels of activation or engagement in art making, and one of it is this at the symbolic level. So you can see here the picture of the sphere. To different people, the sphere might hold different meanings, right? So we work with metaphors and we work with symbols, because sometimes there are just no words. Using symbols and metaphors will be a much more powerful communication of what we are experiencing. I picked a picture of the tree flowers here because it reminded me of a palliative care patient I was working with, who, regardless of what the directive was, what the theme was, she would always invariably produced 3 flowers, whether it was working with clay, whether it was watercolor, or whether it was just color pencil, she would always make 3 flowers. And she never spoke about what these 3 flowers meant or represented. It was only much later on I found out that there were 3 of them in the family, herself, her mom, and her sister. And they were very closely knit. In fact, this was her universe, right? And so when I found out, then it just made perfect sense then. The 3 flowers, the constant theme of the 3 flowers appearing in all her artworks. As I mentioned, in art therapy, the focus is on the expression, the communication, the bringing out of what we are experiencing, and we are not concerned with the aesthetics, right? So you see a picture here of this boy who's happily using a roller and he's just coloring the guitar, right? So there are very few rules, very few do's and don'ts in art therapy itself. We are not concerned about producing pretty things, pretty pictures, because when we're dealing especially with trauma, it is not pretty. In fact, things are very difficult, painful. So we allow ourselves to express it, right? In whatever way we feel comfortable and safe. So art therapy is also about engaging the senses. Remember the lowest level, we talk about the sensorial component of art making. So the pictures here show hands, but the senses are beyond just, refers to not just what we feel, but it could also be what we hear, the different noises, sounds. It could also refer to the different smells and scents. Okay, and always, of course, in trauma work, we need to be very sensitive as well to certain scents or smells can also be triggering. Everything serves a function and a purpose in art therapy. So whether it is silence, whether it is loud and strong emotions, whether it is mess and mess making, right? So in art therapy, the therapist is able to tolerate that and contain that, and allows the client to produce the mess if that is necessary as a way of communicating the pain. Art therapy is also about making conscious the unconscious, right? And sometimes we ourselves may not be fully aware of what might be happening inside the inner landscape of our psyche, of our soul. So hopefully through the art making process, we bring it out and we're able to acknowledge it and witness it. Okay? This idea of embodiment is when the art piece itself holds the pain. So rather than carrying the pain from that trauma, we are able to bring it out and into something, whether it's that painting, whether it's the 3D installation, the sculpture, and that piece, that artwork, now becomes a container for that pain. So it's transferred out, right, as part of that healing. Reintegration of fragmented parts of ourselves through the art making, we bring together all the shattered parts of ourselves, of our identity, and from there, we make new meaning, right, of our experiences and witnessing. As I mentioned, it's not about making pretty, beautiful things. It's about the expression. It's about bringing it out so that the healing can take place. So things which are produced may not necessarily be pretty. Sometimes we may feel that it is yucky or even repulsive, but the fact is that you are now able to acknowledge it. It is what it is. And you have the art therapist together with you to witness what happened to you and what is happening to you. That itself is can be very therapeutic and very powerful. Okay, so that was art therapy. Now we're moving to art as therapy. As I mentioned earlier, art as therapy refers to any creative expressions or artistic endeavors that an individual can engage in without necessarily having an art therapist there to facilitate the process. So art as therapy, how does it work? When we engage in art making or our artistic endeavors or artistic pursuits, we are actually in a state of flow, right? That's focused attention, provides a means of self-soothing, a means of distraction from ruminative thoughts, and it also gives us a sense of achievement, especially when you're able to complete an art piece and it's something that is aesthetically pleasing, something that you're quite proud of, you're happy to show or to display or even to give away to people. That gives a sense of confidence, mastery, right? And sense of achievement as well. In the process of art making, it also gives opportunities for meaning making, making sense of your experiences. Now, some examples of art as therapy, some artistic activities that one can engage in would be coloring, right? I think at the start of the pandemic, there was a lot of, perhaps a lot of focus on even online, social media, on coloring and all these activities. Coloring is helpful because when you're coloring, you are focused on making sure that whatever you're coloring, your colors remain within the lines. So that is a way of exerting control again. Because what trauma does to us sometimes is it shatters our sense of control. Something happened to us, something uncontrollable happened. So when we're doing something, even something as simple as coloring, we are now re-establishing a sense of control and agency. Okay? Zentangle is basically making marks, repetitive marks, and it's free flow, free association, free form. So Zentangle has been known to be particularly useful in calming anxious thoughts. It helps with anxiety because, again, the focus attention while you're just creating this, you may not even have a design in mind, just free association. That helps to move away from the state of hyperarousal, all the anxious thoughts, all that very strong energy, and you focus it into something that you're able to control, and you repeat it over and over, creating this tangle. Doodles is an even freer form, so they are even freer, fewer rules in creating doodles, but it has meaning and interpretation through the symbols and the images that the person creates. Paper is another medium that can be used, whether as a collage, whether as an installation. Collages is especially useful for people who may be new to art making and artistic pursuits, where you may feel intimidated or daunted by watercolors or paints. So sometimes paper seems less intimidating. It's a very accessible and friendly media to start off with for beginners. Nature and found objects. Now, time spent in green spaces and natural lighting has been shown to be beneficial in lifting moods, especially for people who might be experiencing depression and low moods. So spending time in nature, if you're able to do it safely, in Singapore, please remember when you step out, remember to spray the mosquito repellent. But just spending time in nature, taking a walk in the park, and if you're able to interact with objects found in nature, whether it's pebbles, leaves, flowers, seeds, and see how you can actually make something from these things that you collect from nature. So an example here is how dried leaves you can actually paint on dried leaves and make something that's quite aesthetically pleasing, beautiful things, even from nature. Yeah. Mandalas. Mandalas, basically, you start with from the center of the paper, and then you create shapes. You repeat these shapes, and it grows from the center of the paper. It grows outward, becomes bigger and bigger, and you color it in. You can have a certain system or a certain pattern how you color. You can create mandalas using objects found from nature, as you can see here in this picture. This is a mandala that's created from blue pea flowers, saga seeds, cotton fruits, dried basil leaves, pebbles, and such, right? It's quite it can be quite similar to the Indian rangolis as well. So basically, what happens is the repetition, right? The creation of repetitive patterns itself is self-soothing, right? And it's something that is enjoyable. The important thing is, if it works, do more. If you find that you're not enjoying it, you're getting irritated by it because you cannot create what you want to create, then maybe you might want to consider doing something else. But if it works, do more. By all means, do more of it. Clay is also one very accessible medium to use, but please be mindful of if it's triggering for you, then try other medium. Clay, if you find that clay is too expensive, there are cheaper alternatives. You can make your own dough using flour and water, or there are cheaper alternatives that you can find even from Daiso, the super dough, right? Fabric as well. Fabric and textile can be very sensorial, especially the different textures. But also, we need to be mindful that when we're working with fabric, sometimes we have to use scissors or needles, right? And for people who might have a history of self-harming, cutting, or even trauma from medical procedures, just coming close to or using sharp objects itself can be very triggering. So there are alternatives to using fabric. If you do not want to use scissors to cut, you can use adhesives, glue, and paste, right? So fabric and textile. And mixed media. So essentially, when we are engaging with art, there are very few rules, right? To circumscribe or to guide us. Actually, feel free to explore, because we're talking about creativity, learning to explore, learning to experiment, and through it, hopefully even enjoy the process, right? Especially in art as therapy. So what you see here is just some examples of using mixed media, different materials, combining different materials to create pieces that make sense to you personally. Okay, and this is actually my last slide. While we have looked at art therapy, we have looked at art as therapy, I want us to also consider other curative factors that will promote post-traumatic growth, right? We can grow from those traumatic experiences. We can find new meaning, a new sense of being and living, a new way of interacting with ourselves, with others, and with our environment because of the trauma, right? So we attend to the somatics. That means by getting professional help, for instance, we learn how to better tolerate the physiological symptoms of trauma. Yet at the same time, we should also take care of our bodies, right? So take care of your body by eating well and healthy, getting enough rest, because your body is trying to do its very best to keep you in optimal health, right? So help your body, right? So that it's able to produce the necessary hormones and the chemicals, keep everything functioning well. Ensuring our mental and emotional health is also important. So for instance, what we read, what we listen or hear, right? What we watch, what we see, that can impact our mental and emotional state as well. So be mindful of that. Another aspect is of our relationships, right? Our social connections. So certain relationships, if they are toxic and not supportive, then it might make it more difficult for us to recover from our trauma, right? And it might hinder our trauma recovery. And ultimately, I like to say that, especially for adults in trauma recovery, having a sense of one's place in the universe and one's purpose in life itself, having a spiritual sense of where you are, right? It will help in our trauma recovery and healing in order to be able to rewrite the stories of our lives, moving on beyond that trauma, how to integrate it so that it is no longer a millstone that's tied around our neck, but it's actually a way to launch us into personal growth and development even. Okay, so with that, I have come to the end of my slide and the end of my talk.